Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. I will be telling you about part of my ongoing PhD project on the so-called coffee bean sinkers of Late Mesolithic West Norway. First off, you may be wondering what on earth a coffee bean sinker is, so let me tell you. This artifact type is, as far as I know, unique to West Norway. Around 600 of them have been found so far, and you can see the fine distribution on the map here. They have been found mainly in late Mesolithic contexts, as well as some mixed late Mesolithic early Neolithic context and as stray finds. They thus belong to a fisher-hunter-gatherer society, with emphasis on the fishing. These objects are made of various types of soapstone. In their most typical form, they are more or less oval with a lengthwise furrow all around. You can see an example of this basic type on the bottom right, and this is where the coffee bean nickname comes from. However, as you can get some impression of from the other examples here, there is a lot of variety in shape and engravings. They also vary in size, but mostly they are quite small. As you can see on the graph here, the vast majority weigh less than 3 grams and weights over 20 grams are rare. However, although I have cut off this graph at 30 grams, there are also some bigger examples, even over 100 grams. There has been some debate over the function of these objects, but the commonly accepted interpretation is that they were used as line sinkers, so to weigh down a fish hook to get it to the desired depth in the water. So this is what the complete fishing tackle may have looked like. The proposed alternative interpretation was that they were instead used as pendants, because they are often so small and sometimes very pretty. I don't have a physical reconstruction of that to show you, so instead please enjoy my digital artwork. Now, in my PhD, I am doing lots of different things, but today I will only be talking about how we are working out the technical aspects of how these sinkers were made. That means I'll be going over a crafting experiment that we did, how we make and use 3D models for this purpose, and a production trace analysis where we combine the two. So, we have conducted an actualistic crafting experiment to figure out the crafting steps from rough out to final form. Meaning everything except getting the materials and making the tools. We mainly used stone tools based on common local archaeological analogies, including a variety of grinding slabs and handheld grinding stones, as well as sharp tools made of rough quartz and flint. We also wanted a non-stone tool to compare, and for this we used bone splinters, as bone would of course have been readily available in the Mesolithic. In the experiment, we tried various tools and techniques in different combinations in order to construct a set of crafting steps, or chaîne opératoire, which both felt easy and natural to us and produced replica sinkers that closely resembled the originals. This meant first shaping a preform using just about any method, hammering, rough grinding, or a combination of the two. Once we had a piece of about the right size, we grinded this into a smooth blank, on which we then engraved a furrow. As you can see some examples of here, we tried any tool and technique combination that we could think of for this, including using water in the carving process. Everything we tried more or less worked. However, there was definitely a lot of difference between these methods, and we found that a sawing motion with the edge of a quartz flake was by far the easiest and fastest. The flakes of rough quartz have very sharp but irregular edges, which creates an effect like a sawtooth blade, cutting into the soapstone much faster than the more regular edges of flint or bone or the blunt sandstone. Once the furrow is in place, your basic coffee bean is complete, but there are optional additional steps. For side notches, like on the edges of this original, quartz and grinding stones both worked well, provided of course that the grinding stone had a sufficiently sharp edge or point. For the finer additional engravings present on some sinkers, like the cross-hatching here, we preferred flint microblades. These are by far the sharpest and smoother than any other tool we tried except bone, making them very well suited for fine lines like this. Lastly, we experimented a little with various ways of polishing the stone to remove grinding traces and engraving accidents. This was a spur-of-the-moment thing, so we had no specific tools ready for this and had limited success. The experiment also showed that, thanks to how soft and forgiving soapstone is, making these sinkers is even faster and easier than we had expected. I put up some examples here so you can get an idea of the time investment required. On average, making a replica took only 40 minutes, even with additional engravings like side notches or cross-hatching. The experience level of the crafter also made little difference either in terms of time used or the ability to achieve the desired result. So pretty much anyone could have made these objects at any time, any place, and with almost any tools. Altogether, we produced 30 objects during this experiment, of which 25 are replica sinkers and 5 are test pieces. On the test pieces, we aimed for a more controlled comparison of specific tool and technique combinations. Although the amount of control possible is limited in an actualistic experiment like this was very helpful, especially for the production trace analysis that I'll get into more later. Here you can see one of these test pieces and the tools used on it. As you can see, the 6 engraved lines all look quite different depending on both the tool and the technique used. On this piece, with our own experience from trying the different methods ourselves, we can easily tell which tool and technique combination was used on which line just by looking. However, with the original artifacts, things are usually not so obvious. Which brings us to the 3D models. Using photogrammetry and specialized software, we have so far made highly accurate models of over 50 original artifacts, as well as our experimentally produced objects. These models have many possible applications. We can get accurate measurements even at a very small scale or in cross-section. We can also calculate the volume of the sinkers, which in turn lets us calculate the density of the material. And we can get a much better look at surface details. This helps us, for example, to identify possible grinding traces and facets. These can otherwise be hard to see on the very small or eroded sinkers. 3D models also help when the sinkers have very indistinct engravings. On these pictures, you can see some diagonal engravings in addition to the central furrow, but the eroded surface makes it hard to get a good look, especially on the side pictured on the left. But with a 3D model, we can get rid of the surface color, which is already quite helpful, and additionally, we can move the in-software light source around, simulating the use of RTI. As you can see, this can give a much better view of these engravings. Lastly, in this category, the 3D models help construct the relative chronology of engravings. Specialized software can create a colored height map like this. Red parts are further away from us, blue parts are closer. This helps us see when lines dip into other lines. On this sinker, for example, the crosswise lines on the top 2 pictures dip into the central furrow, the clearest examples being the 2 lines here. Meaning the central furrow was already there when these crosswise lines were made. On the bottom 2 images, however, this doesn't happen. So this tells us that the lengthwise furrow around the broad sides was made first, then the crosswise furrows, and lastly the lengthwise furrow around the narrow sides. And now for the really cool stuff, because we can go beyond measuring the engravings themselves and even say something about the morphology of the tools used to make them. For this we use another specialized program, which takes exact cross-sections from engravings and lets us express the profile shape as numerical data. So, for example, the height to width ratio or the angle of the aperture. With the test pieces and replicas from our experiment, we were able to determine how these numbers typically correspond to the tool morphology. So we can tell, for example, whether the tool used was sharper or blunter, whether it was more angular or smooth, and whether it was thinner or wider. Do note that the axes on the graphs here are not to scale, as the program just stretches the profile to fit a standard graph shape. As you can see on the pictures on the left, there is much more variation in height to width ratio between these engravings than is immediately apparent from the graphs. Another interesting thing to note is that the technique used appears to make little difference to the profile produced. As you can see here, the line made by carving with the point of a flint microblade is much shallower and less regular than the line produced by sawing with a long edge. However, the results from the cross-section analysis are very similar for both lines, apart from their absolute depth and width. So, by comparing the results from the cross-section analysis of original sinkers to our experimentally produced data, we can thus get an idea of the morphology of the tools used to engrave the original sinkers. We can then use this to further support and refine the crafting steps we constructed from our experiments. We have only analyzed 10 original sinkers in detail yet though, so we'll have to see if our results so far hold up in future. From the first step, shaping the preform, we have not found traces on the originals, but we also wouldn't expect to, as these would be removed by the next step. But we have found probable grinding traces and facets, as I mentioned before, confirming how these objects were shaped. Then the cross-section analysis so far agrees with our own observation that quartz tools work best for the furrows. We can't be sure that the tools used were really quartz, of course, but the numbers are quartz-like, so the tool would at least have been similar in shape to our quartz flakes. The side notches have produced similar numbers, indicating that the same or a similar type of tool was used on these as on the furrows. So not grinding, or at least not on the sinkers we have analyzed so far. Meanwhile, the numbers from the finer engravings are flint-like, as expected. Lastly, we have not identified traces from polishing, but also wouldn't expect to, as we weren't able to identify these on the experimentally produced objects either. And in addition to tentatively confirming the types of tool and techniques used, the 3D models analyzed so far also confirm that the furrow and side notches were usually made before any additional fine lines. Thus far, the highlights of our results. But before I wrap up, I do want to discuss some of the challenges and limitations of the study. Firstly, the shallower an engraving is, the less certain the results in terms of tool morphology. That said, based on the analyses of our experimentally produced engravings, we are talking less than 1 mm depth before things start to get problematic. Additionally, our study is a pilot study, and further research is needed to better understand the limitations and opportunities of this method. Lab-based experiments with stricter variable control, a larger sample size, and the expansion of the experiment to include more different types of tool and more varied kinds of soapstone would all be very helpful. That said, we have already started further testing our method. Recently, we have done some additional experimentation, including trying our best to make flint-like engravings with quartz flakes and vice versa. Happily, we have so far had no luck fooling the analysis. I will leave it here for today. If you want to know more, I of course strongly recommend you keep an eye out for our upcoming paper on this specific study. Or if you just want more general information about the sinkers, the chapter below gives a great overview. Thank you all very much for listening.